The fact that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had already announced the election in Great Britain for July came as quite a surprise, but probably not for his closest colleagues. His associate Craig Williams is said to have bet on that very election date in advance. And this is quite a PR setback for the Prime Minister, because according to a newspaper report in the British daily newspaper Guardian, this close associate of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has bet on this date for the parliamentary election in July. And just 3 days later, Sunak surprisingly announced that the vote would take place on July 4th. A date in the autumn had been widely expected. Craig Williams most recently worked as Sunak's so-called principal private secretary. That's a kind of assistant with the rank of Under Secretary of State. Williams admitted on X, formerly known as Twitter, "I bet on the parliamentary election a few weeks ago." The responsible regulatory authority, the Gambling Commission, has routinely launched an investigation with which he's fully cooperating. "I don't want to distract from the election campaign. I should have thought more carefully about what that would look like," is what Williams wrote. On May 19th, according to The Guardian, he placed a £100 bet on the election date in July. Sunak announced the date on May 22nd. The potential winnings are £500. The Electoral Commission became aware of the bet via the British betting company Ladbrokes, where the bet was placed. As The Guardian reports, an initial check is probably automatically initiated with the betting company if the name of a politically exposed person appears. Since Williams probably placed the bet via an online account where the user is obliged to provide personal data, it was easy to trace it. Regardless of this, the MP's Code of Conduct prohibits members from causing significant damage to the reputation and integrity of the House, as The Guardian writes. And we know after months of speculation, Prime Minister Sunak has set a date, and for him it could be a bitter deadline. Because now the opposition Labour Party, which is well ahead of Sunak's Conservatives in the polls, called the case completely extraordinary. Jonathan Ashworth, the Labour Party's paymaster, was particularly critical of Sunak's handling of the scandal. Rishi Sunak has been sitting on this information for more than a week, but he lacks the backbone to take action. Once again, Rishi Sunak has been exposed as completely weak, he said. It's unclear whether Williams used insider knowledge to make the bet. The MP, who's running in the Welsh constituency of Montgomeryshire, and please forgive me that I cannot complete that, did not comment on the question. And The Guardian wrote that Sunak has been thinking about the date for some time. A spokesman for the Gambling Commission stressed that betting using insider information is a criminal offence. For Sunak, it is another distraction in the election campaign, and most recently the Prime Minister was also criticised from within his own ranks for leaving the D-Day commemoration ceremony in France early to record a TV interview. "Yes, it all dragged on," says Rishi Sunak, annoyed, and those were the first Prime Minister words in this interview with ITV, for which he left the 80th anniversary of D-Day celebrations in Normandy early. In the group photo, Foreign Minister David Cameron appeared instead of Sunak next to Joe Biden, Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz. That had already sparked a major controversy in Great Britain. Leaving the historic anniversary for election campaign interviews? That's a disastrous image for the already beleaguered Prime Minister. Sunak then claimed that the purely British events were already over, but was nevertheless forced to apologize. In retrospect, it was a mistake not to stay in France longer, he admitted on X. Now the very interview for which he flew back from Normandy early has been broadcast, and is likely to make things even more uncomfortable for Sunak. "It was unbelievable, but it just went on longer than planned," is what Sunak repeated, and he says, "I haven't seen President Biden's speech yet, but well, these are the aftermath of it." And the Prime Minister waved that off, only to then, of course, emphasize his respect for the British veterans. But all these flippant remarks must now be highly embarrassing for him. Actually, this is about political survival and that of his party. The Conservatives' collapse in just a few years is probably unprecedented. In 2019, the party secured a historic landslide victory under the leadership of Boris Johnson. That was a 40-year high. And now, just not even 5 years later, the party which has governed Great Britain for 67 years in the last century is about to slip to a distant third place. This is shown by polls, some of which the party itself is desperately using to advertise. Labour would have 490 seats, the left Liberal Democrats 61 seats, and only behind them the Tories with 57 MPs in the House of Commons. And this would mean that the party would then be barely larger in Parliament than a tenth of its main rival Labour. That's a brutal decline. But why does the party advertise with such polls? To prevent even more voters from moving away, namely to the right. Because Brexit advocate Nigel Farage is giving the Conservatives some serious competition there and is costing them important votes from the Conservative camp. And thanks to the majority voting system, first past the post, this fragmentation could mean that even more seats go to Labour, something the Tories are now warning of and showing in the survey that Farage would not get a seat anyway. It is questionable whether that is true. It's quite possible that Farage's party will win a handful of seats in the end, which in itself would be a historic success. In some surveys, his party is even in a neck-and-neck race with the Conservatives. But it is also clear that, at least in the terms of current seats, they have no prospect of reaching the size of the Tories or even Labour. But Farage now simply seems to see his chance to establish himself as a protest party in the British Parliament. And that's going according to the motto, Sunak is going to lose anyway, so I can be there too when it comes to loudly opposing a new Labour government in Westminster. Probability of becoming the largest party for Labour is 99%, was written by the British election forecasting website Electoral Calculus. It's really just a question of how big the Labour majority will be and how far Sunak's Conservatives can fall, it seems. And the decline began long before Farage's last-minute comeback. The poll numbers have been in the basement for months. Basically, Labour and Tories have swapped places after 5 years. After Johnson's historic victory in 2019, the party was polling at 44%, while Labour was at rock bottom at 22%. And now it's the exact opposite, if not even worse for the Tories. In Sunak's case, it doesn't look like he can turn things around. He seems to be making one faux pas after another. And 5 years after the historic victory of Sunak's predecessor Boris Johnson, the Tories are now far behind the left-wing Labour Party in the polls. After, as I said, 67 years in government, that really is a massive crash looming. And this also has to do with Nigel Farage, who is competing with Sunak from the right. And according to the polls, he's almost on par with the Tories at 14 to 17%. And Mr. Brexit spoke out against the radical measures during the corona pandemic and declared a few weeks ago that Muslims do not share British values. And this speaks from the heart of many Britons. In 2018, Farage founded the Brexit Party, which has been called Reform Party or Reform UK since 2020. He was elected party leader at the beginning of June 2024, and before that he was honorary president of the Reform Party. Farage only recently got personally involved in the election campaign, and since then the party has been doing well in the polls. And the majority voting system means Farage could come away empty-handed, but support for his policies is putting pressure on Sunak and the Labour Party, much to the delight of the British. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.